Welcome to Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we'll walk you through the Epicurean texts and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. We're now in the middle of a series of podcasts intended to provide a general overview of Epicurean philosophy based on the organizational structure employed by Norman DeWitt in his book, Epicurus and His Philosophy. Now let's join the discussion. Welcome to episode 172 of Lucretius Today. We are now in chapter 12 of DeWitt's book, and before we start, let me do a brief recap of where we are and how we got here. We're more than halfway through the book at this point, and we have now for the first time come to a chapter that's devoted entirely to the issue of ethics and pleasure. But what we have done in the episodes leading up to this is give a history of the school, sort of a philosophical context for where Epicurus was himself jumping into the questions about how to live and the nature of the universe and so forth. We've gone through epistemology, we've gone through the sensations, anticipations, and feelings, we've been through physics, we've been through determinism, we've been through last week the question of the nature of the soul, sensation, and the mind. All of that is the foundation for where we're going to be talking for the next several weeks on this chapter entitled The New Hedonism. Obviously, Plato, Aristotle, all of the major philosophers had an awful lot to say about the issue of pleasure up to that point. There's a great book out there called The Greeks on Pleasure by Gosling and Taylor that goes into that background in great detail. But now as we come to chapter 12, we're going to talk about what Epicurus brought to the table and how he applied the conclusions that he had reached in epistemology and physics to his own version of the discussion of pleasure. One of DeWitt's first subchapters is entitled the, quote, summum bonum fallacy. And he is going to take a position on that and certain other issues that not all of us are going to think is the final word by any means on it. May disagree with what he says, but in going through the details of these questions, I think we'll all come out with a better understanding at the end. These are questions that can appear to be easy on the surface, and yet the further you dive into them, the more of a rabbit hole they turn into.
I seem to remember, Cassius, that you even have, before we even get into the text itself, I think that I remember that you have some issues with the word hedonism itself right there in the chapter title. So before we even get into the text, do I remember correctly that you have certain misgivings about the word hedonism itself?
Yes, that's the word that's thrown around in most discussions of Epicurean philosophy. We try in the modern world to put them into categories. We try to put everything into categories. And to the extent that hedonism is a reference to pleasure, my view of this is we would not necessarily consider Epicurean philosophy to be pleasureism. It is a sweeping worldview of all sorts of different aspects of life, from the nature of the universe to the nature of thought and the nature of the body and so forth. And as we all know from reading Epicurus, we don't always choose pleasure. We choose pain at times when it leads to less pain in the future or greater pleasure. So there are many, many different moving parts to Epicurean philosophy that, in my view, can be poorly served if we just use the word hedonism in the wrong context. Obviously, when you're talking to professional philosophers, people who are familiar with these issues, they understand that there's people who place pleasure near the top of the priorities, and so it makes sense to call them hedonists. Let's talk about what are the equivalents or the alternate options to hedonism. If you're not a hedonist, what are you? What other words hit that level of categories?
Virtue would be one with the Stoics, I would think. But that's a very good question. What's the opposite of a hedonist?
Yes, you wouldn't call the Stoics virtuists or virtuism, and then you wouldn't call religious people religionists. To some extent, that makes sense, religionist or religionism.
Yeah, but I've always deists. Yeah, I guess you could.
Deism. Yes, that's right. And so there's probably some other possibilities as well. Would you say Platonism is really rationalism or logicism, or what category would Plato go in?
The word that all of these other people would have used to describe themselves, but probably not people like Epicurus and Aristippus, would be philosophers, lovers of wisdom, as opposed to heedless pleasure seekers.
And I think Epicurus would have certainly considered their own views to be wisdom or true philosophy. Isn't that
Oh yeah,
regularly?
he called everybody. Yeah, he called everybody that studied with him, a philosopher, that they philosophized together. So
Yeah, but
Mhm.
everybody else thought that the Epicureans were basically like pigs.
correct.
Yeah,
Exactly.
hedonism is a negative slur word almost. At
It,
least when we use it today, to call
Yeah.
somebody a hedonist is not a positive thing to say about them.
And that, at least to me, it really gets at its persistent Cyrenaic connotation, because from what I've been able to understand about the Cyrenaics is that they were definitely into, the pleasure of the moment and eat, drink, and be merry and all that sort of thing, because they didn't accept the idea that either feeling calm was a pleasure or that pleasurable memories were actually pleasure. It was all about the sensory input that was pleasure to them. So that whole idea of the modern hedonist is really a Cyrenaic stereotype almost, it seems to me.
yeah, and a Roman stereotype, because there's this persistent myth that people today still believe, which is that the Romans in the middle of a feast would go to the vomitorium and basically throw up everything they just ate so that they can go and eat more.
Exactly, yeah.
Does that sound like fun to you? The
And
vomitorium did.
yeah, exactly. Go ahead. No, this is great. Yeah.
Yeah. The vomitoriums were real rooms in the ancient world. They were the sort of hallways on either side of a stage that the people would enter and leave the stage from. So that's what a vomitorium is. But this idea that people were so utterly shameless and depraved and hedonistic in the ancient world that they would just dash off to this special room just for throwing up so that they could do that and then go back and eat more.
And wasn't that one of Timocrates' slurs against Epicurus, that he would throw up so he could eat more too? Do I remember that correctly?
Yeah, in addition to all of the orgiastic
Exactly.
issues.
Issues.
Yeah.
There's a term you don't hear very often, orgiastic issues.
This is a great way to start the episode, Don. I'm really glad you brought that up. I defend any of these guys, especially the Cyrenaics. I suspect they didn't go around them calling themselves hedonists necessarily. Apparently, they were referred to as Cyrenaics. Like I said previously, our purpose here is not to show that we're virtuosos in the use of words. Our purpose, I think, is for us to understand Epicurean philosophy better, to explain it to people in an understandable way, using words and explanations that mean something to people. And the truth, whether bitter or not, is that the word hedonism is a slur in modern language. And it's not fair to Epicurus to consider him to be totally depraved in that kind of way. Probably not fair to the Cyrenaics, or frankly, anybody who is going to accept the label of being depraved, which is what we read into the word hedonism immediately.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a whole idea of that. Even this lowercase e Epicurean now is seen as a slur, and it's like your dainty food and your fine wines and all that sort of thing. It's that hedonist stereotype that even has bled into that too. And it sounds like even from the ancient world, Epicureans were sort of stereotyped that way.
Right. It's just natural, or the way of the world, that controversy and antagonism is going to arise when you start taking positions that certain positions are right and certain positions are wrong. People get upset about that. They don't like thinking that they are incorrect or mistaken about views that they hold very tightly.
And stereotypes are a way to make it easy for people to think about things. If you put somebody in a box and you label that box with a particular label, and if you don't like those people, you put a derogatory label on it, and then you don't have to think about them anymore. Whenever you refer to them, you just use that word, and it's like everybody knows that, oh, those nasty people over there, those wild Epicureans and their orgiastic issues, that sort of thing.
Yeah, this whole conversation we've had so far, I think, is a really good example of how important it is to be flexible when we talk and to be clear that words have various meanings in various contexts. And it's important for us to keep those contexts in mind and just be as articulate and clear as we can about what we mean when we say something. DeWitt is not attempting to slam Epicurus with a term that is negative when he
with
talks
a
about
lowercase h hedonist, I guess would be
right.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So we've discussed the chapter title. We're back.
That's exactly right.
We're off and running.
So the irony of this whole thing takes over in that first paragraph, where DeWitt says, in his structure of doctrine, Epicurus took up the various aspects of the problem of pleasure and handled them with such superior precision that this line of inquiry, so far as antiquity was concerned, became exhausted. It's kind of like in Lucretius, where he says that the earth, when it was first formed out of atoms, was really fertile, but it's kind of run out now of things to generate. It's that kind of idea. But it's that issue of the superior precision that interests me, because we've been talking about the word hedonism in broad strokes and in bold stereotypes. But there's a whole lot of detail that gets missed when we talk about it in those terms. And I guess that's going to be the point of the chapter, is to go into all that detail.
You know, Joshua, we're not going to read paragraph by paragraph, but as DeWitt continues there in the sentences after the ones you just read, we were joking before we started about how DeWitt can be kind of over the top, implying that Epicurus was just so brilliant that nobody else had anything to say after he was gone. But as DeWitt continues his paragraph, what he says is that, quote, after his time, the various schools merely bickered over the tenability of his findings. Thus, the justification is excellent for entitling this chapter The New Hedonism. And we were joking about it. I hadn't really thought about that, but I really can see the argument that after Epicurus, you really have not had another major leading figure who was identified as making pleasure the good. Do we have anybody like that who follows after Epicurus, or does he really stand at almost the end and now the beginning of the whole chain of making pleasure the good? Does anybody else go in that direction?
In the ancient world, I mean, there was Aristippus of Cyrene, of course, but
before Epicurus, but after.
But beyond that, no, there's no great treatment of the subject that's really put forward, except in negative terms.
And I think one of the reasons that might be is because Epicurus was willing to make pleasure such a wide spectrum of experiences too, because he accepted the fact that you could, have pleasure through the use of your mind and memories and anticipations and that sort of thing. And also that if the other philosophers, they thought that there was a neutral state. If you weren't feeling pleasure or pain, it was a neutral state. Whereas Epicurus is like, no, that sense of not feeling any pain is a pleasure in and of itself too. And so that was another innovation that he was able to include within his spectrum of what pleasure meant.
And that observation that you just made is going to underlie almost everything we discuss in this chapter, because by expanding that definition of pleasure to include any state in which you're not in pain, you've really made a huge change in the way things are going to be discussed. And Cicero and others accuse him of being unfair and ridiculous and out of line in doing that. But as DeWitt said in the last chapter, who's at fault really here? Was it Epicurus's fault for calling all of your experiences when you're healthy and not in pain, calling that pleasure? Or was it the fault and the error of the other side to decide that that state is not pleasurable? So maybe we're talking about whether the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. And by the time we finish talking about all those things, we may be thinking that it's all just an interminable word game. But there are incredibly important issues that flow from the way you talk about and label your experiences in life, whether they're pleasurable or not. This whole issue of, as Don just said, the neutral state, whether that exists or not. You could decide in the end that that's a word game for purposes of logic, or you can consider that it's really true in your personal experience, or all sorts of different ways of getting at it that have to be thought about. But that's where Epicurus is going here in producing a new hedonism, according to DeWitt. He's drilling down and attempting to do what Aristippus and others previously had not done, which was to dig in on the question of what really is the guide of life. Is there another dimension in heaven with God telling us what to do? Is there some kind of determinism? Is there some kind of rationalism out there? Epicurus rejected these other paths and decided that he was going to correct what he saw were the deficiencies in the arguments that Aristippus and others in the past had made. So it's a fascinating subject that we'll have a lot more to say about as we go through this. As we go through paragraph number 2, DeWitt starts pointing out that one of the innovations that Epicurus latched onto in this preliminary discussion here, Aristotle had been studying life and biology more so than Plato had been doing. And DeWitt makes the point that Epicurus follows more along with Aristotle in that sense. But what DeWitt says here is that he was following the lead of his predecessors when he found in the behavior of animate creatures the evidence for identifying pleasure as the end or telos, but he improved upon their procedure, and that's the controversial part. Did he improve upon it or not, according to Cicero? But he improved upon their procedures by narrowing his observations to the behavior of newborn creatures, which as yet possess neither volition nor intelligence. Now, as Aristotle might have been doing, you can look at living creatures like Joshua and Don and Calicini and all of us here who are talking with each other and make deductions about human nature by looking at people who are adults in the prime of life. And it would be easy to ask yourself, well, why should you look at infants who haven't had any experiences and who don't have any of the wisdom that a 50-year-old person has? Why shouldn't you look at the 50-year-old person as your example to find the nature of the good instead of a baby? That's ridiculous. And you have to think about that question, and you should have a ready answer to it in order to understand Epicurean philosophy. But just to throw that out there for a minute, why not look at 50-year-old people instead of baby for your standard of how nature would have us act ethically?
Well, one answer to that is that 50-year-old people all behave differently, but newborns are all the same. Because newborns, unlike 50-year-olds, haven't been exposed to culture and schooling and all of the pressures that are put on the mind to conform and adapt to the way that our particular society is built. Newborns are prepared for any number of possible lives, but by the time you're 50, you've lived a life or a part of one, and that is going to inform how you think about all different kinds of issues. A 50-year-old in Japan is going to be probably different and have different ideas than a 50-year-old in America or in Europe or in Africa.
But why is that experience not a feature rather than a demerit? Like you said, there's more divergence perhaps in the way they act, but why doesn't that just give you a richer field for research to make your ultimate conclusions about the way to live? Why would you look back to an infant of a species that barely even resembles an adult being? I'm, of course, channeling arguments that Cicero made and recorded in certain of his works, but why not take advantage of the experience that comes from being an adult and use those observations as your basis?
The reason is that Epicurus is looking for the human mind in something like its pure or original state. I'm not talking about like a blank slate state, but the state in which the human mind is only reaching for certain things. Here's what infants don't have the power to do. Infants don't have the power to put off one thing because they can conceive of something greater in the future. Right. It's what they do in the moment that suggests to Epicurus that its pleasure is worth pursuing because that's what they pursue, and that pain is to be avoided because that's what they all try to avoid.
And Joshua, I believe you brought up in the past, too, that not only was Epicurus looking at infants, but he was also looking at animals, too, that aren't acculturated and aren't indoctrinated into different kinds of education. You've sort of voiced that concern in the past that that's a good way to look at things if you can explain it from, I believe your example one time was explained at the level of a cockroach or something like that you're sort of looking at that too.
Yes, the principle of the cockroach. Any philosophical claim about the mind or the good that applies to humans, I think, has to also take into consideration lower orders of animals. And that's true about the question as to whether there's an afterlife and all of these other issues.
Yeah.
Are both of you saying that he's looking back to try to determine from infants what nature would say, as opposed to what something else would say, rationality, logic, whatever?
Culture just in general, yeah. What do we do before we are imprinted with culture and our specific society's traditions? And you brought up the differences in people between Japan and Europe and America and that sort of thing. What are people like before you impose those limitations and structures on top of them? What's underlying all of that, I think, is what Epicurus is looking for.
And to answer your question, Cash, is what underlies all of that is nature and human nature.
That's the word I'm wanting to make sure we bring out. I think that is an accurate way to summarize it. In fact, if going back to the initial question of the new hedonism, I think you could make a good argument that Epicurean philosophy is better described as naturism, or something that indicates that it is nature to which we're looking for the answers to all these questions. And it's not obvious that we should do that necessarily. Like I said, Cicero, others would say that you should not look to the cockroach or to a cow out in the field or to an oyster in a shell as an example,
or a pig
as an example for human conduct. Because don't you know, humans are the rational animal, and we have the ability to use logic and reason that is a spark of divinity within us that's so much more important and so much higher than what a cockroach or a cow or an oyster or a pig could ever identify with.
No. Humans have language, which is really the seminal difference. But language, like everything we're talking about here, just comes from nature. It all eventually, in the end, can be traced back to nature, which is why DeWitt repeatedly in this book says nature furnishes the norm. I do have to say, Cassius, your suggestion of calling it naturism, that word's already taken, I think, by people. Another word for them is nudists.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you want to go down that road.
But it all does come back in the end, even when we start talking about pleasure and pain as nature's stop and go signals. It's nature's stop and go signals. When we start talking about justice in the later principal doctrines, it talks about the justice of nature. So I do think it's worth emphasizing that, again, we're not pursuing pleasure just because we've decided personally that pleasure is what we want to do. We're following pleasure and avoiding pain because we've reached the conclusion that nature has created us in this way. And nature may not have an intelligence and an intent in doing it. Nature is not our friend in that sense. Nature doesn't have a goal for our lives. Specifically, everything that happens isn't for good because nature has planned it that way. But we've ultimately reached the conclusion that rather than making things up in our own minds about other worlds and divinities and heavens and hells and so forth, it would be better to simply make sure we're dealing with reality. And maybe the ultimate definition of the word reality is just what nature has provided to us. So I do think that as we go through this and as we debate the nature of all these different questions about pleasure and pain that we're going to be talking about in this chapter, that it does come back to ultimately you vet the question, you test the answer according to, does it make sense according to nature? In line 29 on Ends, Torquato says the problem before us then is what is the climax and standard of things good? And then Epicurus places this standard in pleasure, which he lays down to be the supreme good, while pain is a supreme evil. And he founds his proof of this on the following considerations. Every creature, as soon as it is born, seeks after pleasure and delights therein as its supreme good, while it recoils from pain as its supreme evil, and banishes that so far as it can from its own presence. And this it does while still uncorrupted, and while nature herself prompts unbiased and unaffected decisions. We'll come back to the rest of that explanation because it does go further. But this is nature herself prompting unbiased and unaffected decision-making at this stage, where you certainly are, at least at that moment, free from the corruption of false opinions. No matter what our own opinion is, we think there are others out there that are false. As you grow up and become exposed to so many different divergent arguments, you just know that some of them are not right. So anyway, the point of this opening has been the new hedonism. There's a reason why the chapter is called that, but we're looking to nature ultimately as the standard.
I'd agree with that. That's a good summary of the first, 3 paragraphs?
Well, I think just the first 2 paragraphs, because we now have in this 3rd paragraph where DeWitt goes back to this argument that because the soul is corporeal, just like the body, there is no split, there is no dichotomy between body and mind, with the body and the soul being both on a parity, so to speak. And from this parity, it followed that the good, or telos, which as a unit was pleasure, must also be dualistic, a sound mind and a sound body. Since we've used the word good or telos, let's go ahead and talk about those 2 words for just a second. Obviously, everybody has an opinion, at least what good means. But Don, telos, what does telos mean in Greek?
Telos is the goal or the limit or the end point. That's the whole idea of that. It's the end of the race, the goal at the end of the race, that sort of thing. Would you concur with that, Joshua? I know you've had some posts on the forum about the word as well.
Yeah. I think you're right. What it's become is a whole branch in philosophy called teleology, which is the idea of looking at everything that exists with a view to its purpose. But that's a much broader topic than what Epicurus, or I think even most of the ancients, were looking at, which is what is our purpose, almost is the question, right? What is the goal to which we should aspire?
Right.
And even there, does nature have a purpose for us?
No. I would come down
use
with
the
a
word.
hard no. The way that I've always interpreted telos and good and summum bonum and all those sort of things is the point to which all of our actions, or the thing to which all of our actions point. It's like, why do we do what we do? And Epicurus gives the answer to that it's pleasure. That we're always trying to point towards pleasure. Even whenever we choose pain in the particular moment, we're doing it because we are pointing towards that we want more pleasure in the future, that we're willing to go through this particular pain that we're experiencing because we anticipate more pleasure on the other end of it. So we're always pointing towards pleasure. Our arrow always points towards pleasure. Our path always leads towards pleasure in the widest possible sense. So I think that's the idea of the goal. It's like nature only provides us the idea that pleasure feels good and pain feels bad. So we want to always be pointing towards the pleasurable side of things, even though, like I said, sometimes you're going to experience some pain to get there. And that's what at least in my mind, is the meaning of the goal. There is no purpose to the universe. People who are looking for, the universe is telling me to pursue this particular career. No, the universe isn't doing that. If you want to pursue that career, you go ahead and pursue that career. But the universe is not pointing to you towards any particular way. The only thing that nature gives you is that pleasure feels good and pain feels bad, which is why we want more pleasure than we want pain in our lives.
Yeah, I agree completely, Don, with what you just said. And Lucretius takes it even further when he talks about how the eye doesn't develop with the intent of allowing you to see. Right?
Exactly.
It doesn't work like that. And by the way, one of the most famous images when people think of Darwinian evolution is this image of the ape on all fours, and through several iterations, it becomes man standing on two legs. That's considered an outdated model. It's not wrong to think of things having progressed through those stages. It's wrong to think that that was the goal to begin with, right? Because evolution being natural, there is no goal. It's a response to stimuli, and everything proceeds from there.
Natural selection, whatever. And survival of the fittest is always sort of thought of as like, the strongest and the bravest. No, survival of the fittest just means that, you survived. So evidently your genes were doing something right. So you fit into the environment that you were in. So that's a really good point, Joshua. I think you said that well.
Let me emphasize what we've made just to have been saying. Are we in agreement that nature gives the feeling of pleasure and pain as guides, but that nature does not provide a goal or an ultimate goal?
I would agree with that as far as it goes, yeah.
I agree, but you have to almost get a little more complicated than that, right? The reason that we have things like pain, even though nature, of course, couldn't put it in these terms, is because without a faculty of pain, we would very quickly die, wouldn't we? Pain is the way to keep us from doing things that are harmful to our bodies.
Yeah,
but nature
exactly.
doesn't have. But nature, once again, doesn't have that in view. When our molecules get assembled into a body, it's the successive generations of having, of experimenting and recreating new situations and new dangers and new scenarios, and having endured all of that, our genetic material, having endured all of that, we get to a point where we have faculties like pleasure and pain as a reward and punishment circuit to tell us what things are beneficial for our lives and what things are harmful or dangerous.
Okay, you just said for our lives. Would it be fair to say that nature has a goal for us to live?
I don't think nature cares whether we live or die, actually. But
So you wouldn't use the word goal to describe anything? Because I can imagine somebody arguing that if there's any goal whatsoever that nature has in the most basic possible terms, it might be the sustenance of life. So you would not be comfortable saying that it is nature's goal for us to continue to live.
I think using the English word goal brings along some connotations of that if you get here, you win. So it's sort of like, it's sort of like the old thing about, it's like whoever has the most possessions at the end wins, that sort of thing. In the sense of a goal is if you reach a goal, you win. And it's more of a goal as to, it's like a North Star. It's like a direction to point yourself. You're never actually going to get there, but pleasure and pain, again, it comes down to just that pleasure feels good and pain feels bad. And so at least in my mind, it's better to feel good than it is to feel bad. Help me out, Joshua. I'm floundering here.
I just really want to hit home this issue on the goal or the purpose, because I think it makes sense to talk about it in these terms. And there's two ways to put it. And one of them is to look at, for example, the cancer cell, which starts out as a normal functioning cell, but through a particular mutation, it just gets put into this kind of overdrive where it keeps dividing and dividing and dividing and creating new cells, and those grow. It's not like there's an intent to cause problems or do something bad, right? Well, the self-replicating molecule, deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, that is basically at the heart of who we are. I don't know if I want to put it that way, but the goal, see, again, I use the word goal. The self-replicating,
It's hard, yeah.
Yeah. The self-replicating molecule self-replicates because that's just what it does. There's no purpose or goal there. So everything that has happened around that molecule, which has made up our bodies and in the end, our minds, our consciousness, is rooted in that very simple process of self-replication. One way to put it would be the reason that, for example, some species live a very long time and we don't is because by the time you've already had children, your self-replicating molecule has already replicated, then there's not much more need for you.
Yep.
So those are terms we can put it in just to explain this idea of the goal or the purpose. Nature doesn't have one.
Let me go back to Torquatus for just a second and read some of the rest of what we stated earlier to elaborate on this. When we started out a moment ago and said that every creature, as soon as it's born and is uncorrupted, follows pleasure and pain, he says, quote, so he says we need no reasoning or debate to show why pleasure is matter for desire, pain for aversion. These facts, he thinks, are simply perceived, just as the fact that fire is hot, snow is white, and honey sweet, no one of which facts are we bound to support by elaborate argument. It's enough to draw attention to the fact, and there's a difference between proof and formal argument on the one hand and a direction of attention on the other. Moreover, seeing that if you deprive a man of his senses, there is nothing left to him, it is inevitable that nature herself should be the arbiter of what is in accord with or opposed to nature. Now, what facts does she grasp, or with what facts is her decision to seek or avoid any particular thing concerned, unless the facts of pleasure and pain? So I read that because this is just going to be behind all of this discussion. Is there really anything more in nature telling us what to do and what to avoid other than pleasure and pain? We all seem to be in agreement. Nature does not have a goal that we should grow up to be an astronaut or grow up to be an auto mechanic, or that we are going to do anything in particular with our lives. But nature does provide pleasure and pain to everybody, no matter what your philosophy, religion, background, culture, race, religion, any of that stuff. You have pleasure and pain ultimately from the moment you're born. And that's what to ultimately look to for guidance from nature. But that when you start talking about, there's a couple of words here. We're talking about goal. We're talking about guide, as a word that Lucretius seems to use very specifically in his poem. And then there's also the word good. Don, when good is discussed in Epicurus, what's the Greek that's generally used there?
Agathon is usually the word, but whenever we talk about the greatest good, it's tagathon. So it has that extra T at the beginning to sort of give the idea of that the pleasure is the good, the tagathon.
That's the word then that we're translating as good, and we could spend hours talking about what the word good means. Do you have any particular insight as to any slant or connotation that the Greeks are putting on agathon and tagathon? Because we're going to have to go down this road for a little while of talking about what does it mean that something is good? Because we've just been discussing for the last few minutes that nature doesn't tell us anything other than pleasure and pain. I often wonder if we're not already at this point that nature does not tell us what is good, depending on what our definition of good is. So what's the definition of good? Nature tells us something is pleasing, but that's not the same word as telling us that it's good.
Well, at least in my mind, it would come back to the fact that that something is pleasing is, for lack of a better way, putting it, good for us. I mean, nature doesn't necessarily put value judgments on things, but as a living, sensing being, it's good to feel pleasure and it's bad to feel pain. And those are the words that we give it as living beings, as living sensing beings.
Is it the Epicurean position that there is no good but pleasure and no evil but pain?
I believe I do remember reading that somewhere.
I think Francis Wright comes close to saying exactly that, and I think there's probably some texts that come close to that. But let's talk about that. Is there a meaning to the word good in Epicurean philosophy that is separate and apart from pleasing, pleasure?
One way we've talked about this in the past is to talk about things as instrumental goods, right? But that doesn't really answer your question. You're asking about the word good.
That's a sort of a regression. Yeah, you get infinite regression and without ever coming to a definition. But at least Torquatus here in his discussion of Epicurean philosophy seems to be very clear that nature herself has given us nothing other than the feeling of pleasure and pain as guiding lights, or as you said earlier, the North Star, or as stop and go signals is another word we use for it sometimes. But I guess I should just ask the question, is all discussion of the word good something that is philosophical and in our minds as human beings and it's important for us to discuss, but are all constructs of good and bad or good and evil, are all of those constructs simply mental conclusions that are not directly sanctioned by nature itself?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, if we're going back to you brought up what connotations that the Greeks had for the word good, and so I've gone to our friends at the Liddell and Scott, the LSJ Greek English Lexicon, the Venerable Tome, and so agathos is given a really long entry, so I'm not of course going to read the whole thing, but some of the connotations are kind of interesting to consider, because they will bring up things that agathos could refer to things. Of course, the first definition is good, just good. And then, but they said of persons, it's can connote well-born or gentle. And the opposite of that is kakos. So kakos is the Greek word for evil or bad or that sort of thing. But they also, the word agathos can refer to being brave or valiant or capable or good in a moral sense of things. It can be things that are, and again, they use the word good, but are serviceable, that serve a useful purpose. So it's that sort of idea that it's a benefit or a blessing or that sort of connotation. So there's an idea that it serves a useful purpose. It's capable of doing beneficial things. That's at the heart of what agathos means. And then whenever you put that tau at the beginning of it and get tagathos, then that's the highest or the best good thing. And that's the word. Tagathos is the word that gets translated into Latin as summum bonum. So does that help at all, or am I successfully muddying the waters now?
I think it helps. And one of the things I'm doing here is to, as DeWitt usually does, he gives an introduction, then he goes into detail. There's sort of a telescoping method of presentation. And so I really think we probably need to begin to bleed over into the first of his subsections, which is this issue of the summum bonum question, as his title for the subsection is the summum bonum fallacy. But again, let me go back to Torquatus one more time. And he begins his entire discussion of Epicurean philosophy by saying this: I shall plead my case on the lines laid down by the founder of our school himself. I shall define the essence and features of the problem before us, not because I imagine you to be unacquainted, but with the view to the methodical progress of my speech. And here's the question. The problem before us then is, what is the climax and standard of things good? And this, in the opinion of all philosophers, must needs be such that we are bound to test all things by it, but the standard itself by nothing. Epicurus places this standard in pleasure, which he lays down to be the supreme good, while pain is the supreme evil, and he founds his proof of this on the following considerations, some of the things we've already been discussing. But even at this moment, as we're talking about this, there are serious questions in my mind about this whole framework of analysis. It clearly is the framework that everybody is using, but I often struggle in my own mind whether Epicurus himself really agreed with this framework of presenting things in terms of good and then the greatest good in particular. So why don't we discuss that for a few minutes? We've said that nature gives us pleasure and pain, but has nature told us good and evil other than through pleasure and pain? And why is there a climax of things good? Why is there a single good or a highest good, which is where this is the subsection title of DeWitt, the summum bonum fallacy, and where he goes into this discussion of what the Greek and Latin words would have been. And the ambiguities that are in Greek and Latin.
DeWitt's whole thing about the Latin doesn't have a definite article is just, I think that's just such a Trojan horse that I don't accept that at all, because there are any number of languages that don't have definite articles. It can be just as expressive as languages that do have definite articles. So I think he's going down a blind alley on this one personally.
To me I'm agreeing with you to the extent that I think his suggestion for the answer is perhaps the blind alley. But I do think the question he's asking is incredibly important, and one that doesn't really get asked enough, that we do need to dive down and decide what the word good really means. Are there multiple goods? Is there a single highest good? Apparently summum bonum is the word in the Latin that was being used, and that certainly would seem to imply a highest or best good. Well,
and in my mind, the whole idea of highest is not necessarily, doesn't mean the best as in a value judgment. The highest is the one that's at the top of the heap that everything else is pointing to. That's always been my interpretation, that it's, for lack of a better analogy, pleasure's at the top of the mountain, and that's where all of our paths are heading as far as what we should be looking for. Or pleasure is the highest star in the sky that we use to guide our paths by, because we're always trying to maximize our pleasure over time as opposed to, or minimizing our pain over time. We're always pointing towards that particular highest point that we can see, that highest landmark. That's the one that we're pointing to. That's the sense that I get as in the highest. I think that I don't see it as a value judgment, other than the fact that it's the one to which everything else points.
Joshua, anything?
What's interesting to me is that this is not the only category he has on this question, because he says we assume this is him. Of course, the Vatican sayings are a little unclear on this issue, but Vatican saying 78 says the nobleman is chiefly concerned with wisdom and friendship. Of these, the former is a mortal good, the latter an immortal one. So now we've got goods and highest goods and mortal goods and immortal goods.
I don't guess we know for sure whether the Greek there is agathon, tagathon, or some hedonism.
I would be happy to check. Which one was that again?
Do you have time to?
Yeah. Which one was that again? Which Vatican saying?
That's Vatican saying 78. It would be good to have a good understanding on some of these issues, wouldn't it?
It is agathon. Agathon is the word there that's used.
Okay, but hey, before we go too much further, let's go back and make sure we remind everybody of the Plutarch excerpt about not going around uselessly talking about the meaning of the word good for all sorts of reasons. I mean, that may be a description of what we're doing in today's podcast, but does anybody know that one off the top of your head? Because that one ends up being arguably very closely on point. Usner 423, Plutarch, that Epicurus actually makes a pleasant life impossible. Not only is the basis that they assume for the pleasurable life untrustworthy and insecure, it's quite trivial and paltry as well, inasmuch as their thing delighted, their good, is an escape from ills, and they say that they can conceive of no other, and indeed that our nature has no place at all in which to put its good, except the place left when its evil is expelled. Epicurus, too, makes a similar statement to the effect that the good is a thing that arises out of your very escape from evil, and from your memory and reflection and gratitude that this has happened to you. His words are these: that which produces a jubilation unsurpassed is the nature of good, if you apply your mind rightly and then stand firm and do not stroll about prating meaninglessly about the good.
That's okay. So that's an obvious jibe at the expense of Aristotle and the Peripatetics, right? Because that's what the word peripatetic means. They walked about and discussed philosophy. So that's part of the explanation on that quote.
Is that you can end up spending your whole life walking around in circles and never come out of that circle if you get caught in it without some way to extricate yourself from this dilemma of what is the basis for good. It's the question that we talk about in terms of virtue as well. What is the justification for calling something virtuous? What's the justification for calling something good? Is there something out there that's good, that is desirable in and of itself, that has that quality? And if so, what is the justification? What is our connection? What is our appreciation or ability to know whether something is good or not? And it seems to me every time.
Epicurus comes down and he says pleasure is the only thing that you can say is in and of itself good.
Which makes perfect sense when you've said that nature only gives us pleasure and pain as faculties through which to choose and avoid. It would be logically crazy to come up with another answer. If you say that nature has only given us pleasure as the tool by which to judge what is desirable, then how in the world are you going to be able to judge the good without pleasure? Unless you go outside of nature, which takes us back again to that original point about the importance of considering nature to be the standard or nature to be the norm.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where acculturation and indoctrination and education comes in. That your society can tell you, one thing is good, and that you can't trust pleasure, and pleasure is bad. And we have a whole culture set around that with our Puritan ethics in the United States and things like that. So that's one of those acculturated things too. So, but nature's the one that says, pleasure makes you live and pain will make you die.
Yeah, I agree with that. But you also have there's so many different roads on this topic you can go down. But there's that famous phrase that people, particularly who frequent gyms, will use when they say no pain, no gain.
Right. But they're pointing towards more pleasure after the pain, though. They're going to be in better shape though after the pain. So.
Yeah, then that's the key issue is that you've got this one thing that is the gravity well of everything else in your life.
Well put. Oh, I like that. Nicely done, Joshua.
Yeah. And so everything else that gets you there, that's instrumental in getting you there, connects it back to the instrumental good. But sometimes pain is necessary. You have to go through that in order to get there.
Exactly. And even Epicurus says that you can't live pleasurably without living nobly and justly and that sort of thing. And so those are all instrumental ways to get to pleasure. But pleasure is the point, that guiding star, that summit of the mountain, that, whatever analogy or whatever metaphor you want to use, that's where you're always trying to point. Even if you're in the gym and no pain, no gain, you still want to be more healthy and you still want to have more pleasure in your life. Even if you don't want to say that's still what you're pointing towards.
Okay, for our list, we are still approximately on page 218 under his heading Summum Bonum Fallacy. And let me go ahead and raise this issue, and I don't know that I'll dispose of it entirely with what I'm about to say. But again, going back to what Don alluded to earlier, DeWitt can raise incredibly important questions and in my mind come up with some very creative answers, but those answers are not always totally satisfying to us. And the benefit of DeWitt in many cases is his bringing his experience to bear to say that we should not just accept something as obvious and move on. In this section, what DeWitt does in his unique way is end up concluding that indeed it is not pleasure that is the highest good, but life itself that Epicurus held to be most important. And if I were trying to defend that conclusion, one of the observations he makes either here or in a longer article on the same subject is that he talks about how pleasure and pain have no meaning except to the living. And clearly, in Epicurean philosophy, you've got to be living to experience anything good or bad. Principal doctrine number 2 says that if you're not feeling anything, then that's the equivalent of death. And so you've got a lot of issues that do surround what DeWitt is pointing out here about the importance of being alive in order to understand pleasure and pain. It's not like a religious perspective where there's an abstract pleasure and an abstract pain, and you somehow get credit, as Don was referring to earlier in the conversation, about reaching some kind of a goal or a plateau where you've checked a box and therefore you've somehow accomplished something by checking this box, that all of a sudden you'll live happily ever after if you do check the box. That's not the Epicurean universe at all. So where you have to go with all this is, as we will in the rest of this chapter, go through and through different meanings of ataraxia, aponia, tranquility, the absence of pain, all sorts of different ways of getting at these things. But it seems to me the biggest enemy in all of these discussions is just to leave your conclusions on a superficial level and think that something that really is not stated is being said. All of these words have, as we've been discussing, multiple meanings, and they have to be separated out in order to make sense of the final conclusion.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point there about just words in general. Is that we're dealing with the connotations and semantic baggage of English words. We're talking about trying to translate them from ancient Greek and from Latin and from Greek to Latin and from Latin to English, and so there's a lot of rabbit holes I think you can go down whenever you start looking at these individual words and things like that. Not that it's not important, but it can really just complicate things when you're trying to sort all that out.
Don, that reminds me of what Joshua said a few minutes ago about why we don't look at 50-year-olds as the standard. Looking at a newborn infant in the year 2023 should produce pretty much the same observations as looking at a newborn infant in Athens in 320 BC.
There you go.
In other words,
that's well put. I hadn't thought of that, but that's a good point.
We ought to be able to have some confidence that we can duplicate where Epicurus would have been going. When you start at a point like that where you have not been corrupted by false philosophies or false religions, the observations that he's making in looking at infants ought to be the same observations we would come up with 2,000 years later. And just like Lucretius talks about in several ways, one step lights the way to the next, and like a hunting dog, you smell out. Once you get the scent of the prey, you can go after it. The perspective we should have is not that this is all just arbitrary and it's not all just a word game. We ought to be able, each of us individually, to do many of these same observations and think through in the same way that Epicurus did himself. And you would think that you would begin to reach similar conclusions if you start with the same premises.
Yeah, that's a great point. That is a great point. This might even be a good spot to sort of closing remarks and that sort of thing, because I think you really had a really good that was a really good point I think that you made there.
Okay, so yes, Don, there's a whole lot more in the material over the next couple of pages that we will get to next week. But let's go ahead and start talking about closing thoughts on what we've discussed today and trying to set the stage for the discussion of the chapter. Martin, anything today?
Sorry, I have nothing.
Okay. Calasini.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting point when somebody said today that Epicurus and Epicureans thought of themselves as philosophers, not hedonists. And somehow that was sort of a new idea for me to hear, which really is quite a simple idea, but makes sense.
We're following pleasure because we think that nature gave us that as the guide, not because we're simply arbitrarily deciding that having a good time is the best way to spend our life. My gosh, all of the background, all of what Epicurus was doing in atomism and epistemology was trying to reach that conclusion of what is nature telling us to do, what is the best life. You have to first address that before you just take the position that having fun or pursuing any particular type of pleasure is the way you should spend your life. Because all of us have the desire not only to have fun, but to be real, to be truthful, to be wise, and not to be deceived.
Yeah, that whole idea of the word philosopher, I think, is kind of fun, because even in the Epicurus' will in Diogenes, Epicurus refers to the school basically as those who philosophize together. So that's how he refers to his students and his school and that sort of thing. It's like those who philosophize together. We're going to do this. So that it's kind of an interesting, and it's actually one word in the Greek, which I think is kind of great.
Yep, that's how you live as a god among men, is to do this with like-minded friends.
There
and
you
so
go.
forth.
Exactly.
Don, closing thoughts?
No, this has been a great conversation. So I think that this really sets the stage. I love the fact that we spent a good portion of the conversation just on the title itself with the word hedonism. So that shows you the issues that come up here. So this was quite an enjoyable conversation. I'm looking forward to see where this goes in the future here.
Joshua.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Don just said. It is interesting. DeWitt started the chapter by saying that Epicurus had more or less exhausted the question. I think it's always a little too early to call curtains on something. And we see that in the 5th century when St. Augustine of Hippo said about Epicureanism that the ashes were so cold that not a single spark could be struck from it. And once again, it's a little too early to call curtains on that. So we're going to be talking about issues like this for a long time, hopefully, and in the next couple of weeks, specifically on this one issue about pleasure and the new hedonism.
What are we doing right now other than talking about pleasure through the lens of Epicurus, who after all these years still remains the most identified philosopher for this position? Okay, well, with that, let's go ahead and close for the day. We'll come back next week. Please let us know at the forum if you have any questions or comments. We'll incorporate those in future episodes. Thanks for your time and listening, and we will be back next week. See you then. Bye.